By every measure, by every statistical measure, we're stronger than any political party has been in, well, maybe in my lifetime, objectively speaking. Memberships, fundraising, poll numbers.
Right, so people are positive in consequence of that. So it's a lot easier to lead an organization when it's successful.
That's
obviously,
right.
People are much more enthusiastic.
Yes.
Why do you think you're in that position? What's going on that's setting the stage for that? And I don't just mean the failures on the Trudeau side. I mean, what do you think you guys are doing right?
Well, we have a clear mission statement, and people know exactly why we're in this. Whenever someone asks me if they say, I'm thinking of running for parliament or for mayor or some other political position, what's your advice? Well, I said, well, before I get to the advice, I have a very simple question. Why do you want this job? Mm-hmm. And it might seem like a simplistic question, but it's actually the most important question in life. Why? Why are you doing what you're doing? And our answer to that is to bring back the Canadian promise that anyone who works hard gets a great paycheck and a pension that buys them good food and a nice home and a safe neighborhood, that anyone from anywhere can do anything and that people are in charge of their own lives. That's effectively what we want to deliver. So every day when I'm in Parliament.
So that's a very local vision in a sense, right? It doesn't have the grandiosity of an international utopian vision, for example.
Well, maybe
it's very down to earth.
I think people are sick and tired of grandiosity. In fact, I think there's something grand about a family that can go on a nice road trip and share stories and build lasting memories that the kids will remember when they're 85 years old.
Despite
I think that's
producing all that nasty carbon dioxide.
That's right. I think those things are grand. And I think with the problem we've had in this country and in all of the countries that have been afflicted by this horrendous utopian wokeism is that it's been focused on the grandiosity of the leadership, of the egotistical personalities on top, and not the things that are grand and great about the common people. And that is another reason why I think we're doing very well. People are saying finally there's someone who's focused on letting me take back control of my own life and create a great future for my family. So that is, to answer your question, one of the reasons why we've had such incredible success over the last 2 years. People do now have some hope. They think that things can be turned around, and they have clearly and correctly diagnosed the problem, which is entirely political. There is no physical, geographic reason why Canada should struggle to supply people with great opportunities of home ownership and family formation. In fact, we should be the richest country in the world. And people increasingly know that, and they know that if we make the right, albeit difficult, political decisions, that they will once again be able to do as their parents did, which is to say, get a house, start a family, live in a safe neighborhood, raise their kids with good traditional values. Our young people are saying, I want to start a business. I want to invent something. I want to create things. I want to become a tradesman, and then when I get good enough at that, I want to hire 5 other tradesmen, and by the time I retire, I want to have 300 employees, and then I want to give that company to my kids. These are the stories that I hear when I go out and about in Canada, and the great news is we can have all those things. That's the optimistic message that I have for people. But we've got a limitless supply of resources here. We're like a cornucopia. The third biggest supply of oil, 5th biggest supply of natural gas, biggest supply of uranium, 5th biggest supply of lithium. We've got not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 coasts to tidewater.
Right.
We live next to the biggest military and economic superpower the world has ever seen. We have a highly educated population and the best system of government in the history of the world, the parliamentary system. Not the best government, but the best system of government. So all these massive advantages, we just need to unleash that potential. Like 10 years ago, the New York Times wrote an article, Welcome to Canada, we're home of the world's most affluent middle class. And in that article, the Times had calculated that median American and Canadian incomes were tied, and that Canadians were slightly better off Now, part of that was because of the 08-09 financial crisis hit them harder than it hit us. But still, now per capita GDP in the States is $22,000 higher than in Canada, measured in USD. Their real estate is significantly cheaper than ours. So their dollars go a lot further, even when you match up the exchange rates. And what's worse than that is that the leading indicators are even more horrific. And leading indicators, for example, are investment dollars, because your wealth tomorrow is determined by your investment today. So if your employer, for example, is buying lots of new tools and technology, you're going to be able to crank out more widgets. So you crank out those widgets, then you can ultimately make more income down the road. If you take business investment and divide it by the number of workers, the American worker gets $28,000 of investment measured in US dollars.
This is per capita?
Per worker.
Or per year?
Per worker, per member of the labor force.
Okay.
So you take the total business investment of the United States divided by the total number of workers in America, it's 28 grand. In Canada, it's 15 grand. So the Canadian worker gets about 55 cents for every dollar of his American, and they're both measured in USD. So how is the Canadian worker?
That's investment in future productivity?
That's investment in machines, in technology, in warehouses, factories.
I see.
Any capital investment that businesses make divided by the number of workers, that's the measurement. So now that means they're getting better technology, better new machines, better tools than our workers, and they will be able to crank out even greater wages for their people than we will, unless we catch up with that. Our productivity is another major problem. Right now, and that's productivity sounds complicated. It's actually extremely simple. You just take the GDP and you divide it by the hours worked in the country. So American GDP is $80. So for every hour an American worker works, on average, he or she produces $80 of GDP. In Canada, it's 50. So that's every hour. So that means we have to work 60% more just to make the same amount and have the same level of income to buy food and housing. And so now that sounds like a bunch of wonk speak that might seem like it only matters to someone staring at a spreadsheet or a graph or a chart. But in fact, that's reflected in the fact that our 2 million people are lined up at food banks because they can't afford food, and 80% of youth can't afford homes. And our quality of life and the things we can afford to provide our kids have fallen back so much.
Well,
There's
it's a pretty
life.
stark and easily comprehensible statistic.
Yeah.
I mean, if you work and you produce $80 worth of goods and services in an hour compared to working and producing 50, obviously that's a substantial shortfall.
Yeah.
So, and is there a starker indicator of the economic disparity between the US and Canada than that? Or do you think that's the primary statistic?
I mean, I think housing costs are another one. There was a study out just 10 days ago that has Toronto and Vancouver now by far the most unaffordable housing markets in North America. And so, housing costs are 50% higher in Toronto than they are in Chicago, even though Chicago workers make 50% more money. The same is true between Vancouver and Seattle. Seattle workers make way more than Vancouver workers, but housing is 60 or 70% more expensive in Vancouver. And we're paying the difference by accumulating enormous quantities of debt. Our households are by far the most indebted in the G7. When you divide total household debt by GDP, we now have a bigger stock of household debt than our entire economy. We are more indebted as households than the Americans were right before the 2008 financial crisis. And so what we have as a model in Canada is we have artificial scarcity imposed by a very heavy and restrictive state, confiscatory state. So that suppresses production. But in order to allow for consumption, we print money and borrow money and then flood the economy with that money.
Okay, so that's another problem. So that's the inflationary problem.
Yes.
Now, the problem with inflation, there's many problems with inflation, but one of them is that it particularly punishes people who are thrifty and who save.
Yes.
Right. So inflation punishes the people who forego gratification to invest in the future.
That's right.
Right. So that's a very bad idea.
Inflation is the single most immoral tax for so many reasons. One, it takes from savers and people who are trying to be responsible, thus making it impossible to be responsible.
Right.
Because you will, if you refuse to play the inflation game of borrowing money to buy things you can't afford, someone else inevitably will, and you won't be able to afford anything. So you ultimately have to act responsibly. It's like Milton Friedman was asked, what would you do with your money in times of inflation? He said, spend it.
Right.
Like the first thing you want to do when inflation is out of control is to make sure you get rid of this thing that's losing its value. The second reason it's immoral is it takes from the poor, because the poorest people they do not have the ability to buy inflation-proof assets like gold and real estate and fancy watches and art collections and fancy wines and things that go up with or even exceed inflation. So it's a very big wealth transfer from the poor and the working class to the very, very wealthy. A very small group of people actually get richer. Yes, I mean, all the socialist policies in practice redistribute from the working class to the super wealthy in practice. And I can prove that again and again and again.
In theory.
In practice.
Yeah.
In practice, all the redistribution that happens in these so-called socialist countries ultimately goes from the working class to the super wealthy. That is the reality. But just one last thing on inflation. The final reason why it's so immoral is nobody votes on it. The basic principle of our parliamentary system is the government can't tax what Parliament has not voted. The people no taxation without representation, right? But no one ever votes to have the money printing happen. And so the inflation is adopted secretly, and you blame the grocer because groceries are more expensive, or your local gas station because gas is more, or your realtor because when in fact it was actually the government that bid up all of those things with money printing, and you didn't even know about it. So it is silent. It's a silent thief that takes from the poor and gives to the richest people, and it destroys the working class. And that's why I want to crush inflation. We need a policy that seeks to stop inflation at all costs.
Okay, so what would you do to stop inflation?
Well, we stop the money printing. You know, and the money printing is just a means to fund deficit spending. Governments borrow to
define the deficit, for people.
So basically the deficit is the difference between what the government spends and what it brings in.
It's usually calculated on a yearly basis.
That's
deficit.
right.
Yeah. And the debt?
Well, the debt is just the accumulation of the deficits.
Right.
So the deficit right now is $62 billion. And
I thought it had a ceiling of
41 billion, right.
Wasn't that a ceiling?
Yeah.
Guess not, eh?
I guess not. Look, there are very real present-day consequences for that. Deficits increase the money supply. Central banks effectively facilitate that increase in the money supply, and that causes inflation. That is the consequence of the money supply growing vastly quicker than the stuff that money buys. So what we have to do is stop growing the money supply and start growing the stuff money buys. Right? Produce more energy, grow more food, build more homes. We have to unleash the free enterprise system to produce more stuff of value. And this is where we have to remove the artificial scarcity that the government is imposing on the population. Let's incentivize our municipalities to grant the fastest building permits in the world to build homes.
And you have a plan for that in principle?
Yes. I mean, I'm going to say to the municipal governments, they either speed up permits, cut development charges, and free up land, or they will lose their federal infrastructure money. So they will have a powerful carrot and stick incentive to speed up home building.
And the percentage of a new house price that's a consequence of government taxation and regulation?
C.D. Howe took the cost of compared the cost of building a home to the cost of buying a home.
Yeah.
And he said, what's the gap between those two things? So they added up land, labor, profit for the developer, materials, And they compared that to the sale price, and they found the gap was $1.2 million. So that's $1.2 million of extra cost above and beyond the materials, the labor, the land, and the profit for the developer. So where's that going? Well, the answer is development charges, sales taxes, land transfer taxes, the delays in getting the permit, time is money, the consultants, lawyers, accountants, lobbyists that the developer has to hire in order to get the approval. So in other words, we're spending twice, in Vancouver, we spend twice as much on bureaucrats than we do on all other things combined to build a home. More money goes to bureaucrats than goes to the carpenters, electricians, and plumbers who build the place. And to add insult to injury, those tradespeople who build homes can't afford to live in them. We just need to get the government out of the way. The same goes for our resource sector. I mean, why is it that we're still importing oil when we've got the world's third biggest supply? Why is it we can't export our natural gas overseas? Our secret sauce is our energy, our incredible supply of energy of all kinds, hydro, nuclear, natural gas, you name it. So let's unleash the production of these resources and bring all that money home.
We could try to organize things so that energy superpower wasn't an insulting phrase.
Well, National Bank did a study. If you want to talk to these environmental loons that hate our energy sector, they said, the great economist Stéphane Marion out of Calgary, National Bank, said if we displaced half of the electricity demand that India will have added to its grid over the next 20 years by supplying our natural gas instead of them using coal, it would reduce global emissions by 2.5 billion tons, which is 3 times the emissions of all of Canada. So in other words, by exporting our gas, which is half as emissions intensive as coal, we could do far more than we could even do if we shut our entire economy down and disappeared from the earth. So why don't we address the environment with energy abundance instead of energy poverty? We have a prime minister who is dedicated to a extremely radical ideology. It is just a rehashed socialism that has been discredited again and again and again throughout the ages. And his basically authoritarian socialism has guided him throughout his entire prime ministership. He believes in a state that controls every aspect of your life, your money, your speech, your thought. He controls the economic, all of the industries of the country. And every time that has been tried, it is a complete disaster. So there's no mystery involved. It is the same old disastrous outcome that results from the same old disastrous policies.
Right, that have demonstrated themselves as disastrous continuously throughout the 20th century.
Exactly.
Okay, so one of the things that I think is particularly striking, I saw Stephen Guilbeault, who's probably the minister in Trudeau's cabinet who's most fervently
he describes himself as a socialist.
Economy. Well, this is the thing. Yeah. So he described himself as a socialist. And so for all you international people listening, Canada has always had a socialist party, and that's the New Democratic Party, the NDP, which is currently run by Jagmeet Singh, who's propping up Trudeau, all his protestations to the contrary. And Canadians have always been, about 20% of Canadians have stably supported the socialists, the NDP in Canada. And that's been true since about 1962 or something, when they first popped up as a federal party. Now, the Liberals, and that's Trudeau's party, have been a centrist party, historically speaking, and they were the home of the classic Liberals, all things considered. And they like to steal good ideas from the left and from the right and chart Canada's course down the middle. The thing about Trudeau's Liberals is they're not Liberals, is they're far left socialists. And they came to power in the guise of Liberals, and that meant that their government was fraudulent, technically speaking, from the beginning. Because Guilbeault, for example, obviously should have been a member of the NDP and not the classic traditional Canadian Liberals. But he didn't care, because he knew that had he run for the Socialists, he would have ended up with 20% of the vote, because that's what they always do, and never had any clear pathway to power.
Exactly.
And so Trudeau brought a bunch of people in who were so radically left that they left the NDP in the dust, essentially. And they've been running the country on false pretenses for 9 years. And if you ally that with the fact that Trudeau is clearly, he clearly has narcissistic personality characteristics and runs the country, I think, as a testament to his own grandeur. It's something like that. And one of your caucus members recently stood up in the House and I think listed something approximating 60 scandals. I mean, I've been scandalized by that, because my observation, I've been watching the Canadian political landscape for, 5 decades, and the Trudeau government has skated through at least a half a dozen scandals that under normal circumstances would have provoked an honorable government to resign. And then that doesn't count the other 54.
Yeah.
And so at the moment, Trudeau's grip on authority is very shaky. His deputy prime minister resigned last week in a cloud of catastrophic, surreal manipulation. He shuffled his cabinet this week. At least a third of his caucus doesn't have any confidence in him, but he's being propped up by the Socialists, Jagmeet Singh in particular, who also continually proclaims publicly that he is an opponent of the Trudeau government and is standing up against him, while refusing categorically to do anything, to do the thing that's actually in his power to bring down the government. So do you want to, I just can't understand this at all. So do you want to walk us through this?
Well, let's first of all shed a brief tear for Jagmeet Singh, because the problem he has is that he's trying to be an NDP leader and we already have an NDP prime minister. I mean, Justin Trudeau is, he's actually much more radical than the traditional NDP.
As the NDP themselves admit, the previous leaders of the NDP.
Yes, he attacked the NDP Trudeau attacked the NDP for being too conservative.
Yeah.
But because he had the comfortable blanket of the Liberal Party, which governed for most of the last century, people didn't realize what kind of radical they were dealing with. Yeah. The second problem Jagmeet Singh has is that all of his political ideology is implemented now. So, and we're seeing it. Like, people look around and say, okay, this is what it looks like. The utopia the NDP has been spinning in the corner of Parliament. They told us everything was going to be free and wonderful and just, and there would be
racial equity.
There would be there would be unicorns and butterflies and rainbows, and this would be the utopia. Well, now that all of their policy agenda, all of their agenda is implemented, and people look around and it's a hellscape. Mm-hmm. We have 1,400 homeless encampments in Ontario, 35 in Halifax. We have hate crimes are up 253% in the last 9 years. The military is decimated. Wages are dropping. Like, it's the list goes on. And so Jagmeet Singh is trying to disown that ideology, even though that it belongs to him. And he's trying to unsuccessfully to convince people that he's somehow different than that, when in fact Trudeau has only been doing what Singh would have done in his place. And so it is a classic for socialists. What they try to do is change their names and move on and try to have everyone forget their past. Mm. And when I say that socialists changed their names, I mean, they were communists, and then they became socialists, and then they became social democrats, and then they stole the word liberal, and then they ruined that word, so they changed their name to progressives, and then they changed their name to woke, and now they claim they don't want to be called woke anymore. Mm-hmm. The socialists always try to disown the things they've done because it's manifestly disastrous, and that is what Singh is trying to do, while simultaneously keeping Trudeau's government going. He voted just a couple of weeks ago against a non-confidence motion that I put forward, which contained Singh's own criticisms of Trudeau in Singh's own words. So he voted against his own words to keep Trudeau in power. But I will remind people.
How do you account for that from a motivational perspective? I mean, the scuttlebutt in the Canadian press is that Singh is propping up the government for personal reasons, say, regarding his pension. Now,
Yes.
you're making a much more political case. But I can't understand how
both.
he can reconcile himself to himself, because what he does is so at odds with what he says that it couldn't be more different. Like, if he allied him, the other thing I can't figure out, maybe you can shed some light on this, is like, when Singh agreed to act as Trudeau's support, why the hell didn't he negotiate a cabinet seat? I mean, why didn't he make it into a formal coalition? I know that's not a traditional Canadian move, but it could happen. And so he sold his soul to Trudeau fundamentally, decimated his own party, and gained nothing in return, including what he could have gained had he bargained properly. That's how it looks to me. And what do you think about that?
I mean, he's not a very good negotiator, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And what you're seeing is all of these egomaniacs in both the NDP and what we now call the Liberal Party are turning on each other because they all want to disown their collective record. All of them want to say, "Oh, I wasn't part of this," and whether it's the outgoing finance minister Freeland or Mark Carney, who's been writing the financial plan behind the scenes, or Jagmeet Singh. They're all trying to say, I wasn't there, I wasn't part of it, I'm something completely different than what you see. That is just an illustration of how much of a disaster their agenda has been. And I think that's why we're doing so well, and we're going to defeat them, and Canadians will give me a mandate to take the country in a completely opposite direction.
Okay, so what do you see on the horizon in the upcoming year? I want to talk about two things. What you think is going to unfold, well, even in January, I mean, once Parliament reconvenes, and what you expect from Trudeau in terms of his political action, then what you expect as the Liberal Party tries to reformulate itself. Like, I can't imagine a scenario, not really, where Trudeau leads the Liberals into the next election. That seems to me highly improbable. It wouldn't surprise me if he has to be removed kicking and screaming, so to speak. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on what are Canadians to expect in the upcoming months.
So Parliament's back in late January. It will take some weeks to actually get a non-confidence vote onto the floor of the House of Commons. Then we'll see if Jagmeet Singh's latest promise of voting non-confidence was as insincere as his prior commitments to that effect.
When does his pension kick in?
In February. So he's now, basically, he said yesterday that he would put forward a non-confidence motion at the earliest opportunity. Well, that's likely to be March, which is...
Oh, that's convenient. Okay,
Right
so that
after.
problem's off. So really,
That's right.
so March is the earliest, as far as you can see, that election could be called.
Again, we won't have an election before very late winter, early spring. Then there's the possibility that the Trudeau resigns and then goes to the Governor General and says we need to shut down Parliament, while the Liberal Party then chooses a new replacement, a Trudeau 2.0. And so there would be a leadership race. God knows how long that would drag on for.
You think approximately in March, no earlier than March, as far as you can foresee.
Yeah, probably. And during which time we'd continue to flounder and twist in the wind. And by the way, the Liberal media is all saying, well, surely you wouldn't want to trigger an election during the Liberal leadership race. Excuse me, the Canadian people are not obliged, 41 million people are not obliged to wait around while this party sorts out its shit. These guys could have got rid of Trudeau a year and a half ago. They knew he was a disaster then. And now they say, well, we're low in the polls, so we have to get rid of him. Now, you didn't care when he was just depriving single mothers of food for their kids, or doubling housing costs, or unleashing crime in neighborhoods across the country. But now you're really concerned about getting rid of him because your poll numbers are down and you want to keep your job. Sorry, that's not a good reason to paralyze the entire country, in the face, by the way, of a major negotiation with the incoming U.S. president. who enters with a massive and powerful mandate, and a man who has proven that he can spot weakness from a mile away. So the country should not be forced to wait for the Liberal Party to clean up its own mess. They've had plenty of time to do that. What we need now is certainty, and the only way that can come is through an election so the people can decide.
So what do you see? Let's do this. I want to know what you see as, like, frankly speaking, I don't envy you your job. And or the people, by the way, in the Trump administration, because it's very glamorous at the moment for them. But if they're going to cut government inefficiency in a serious manner, they're going to be doing hard administrative labor for a very long period of time. Now, you're going to take the helm of Canada when there are 5 dimensions of trouble brewing, and more serious trouble on all of those dimensions than I've ever seen plague Canada in my entire life as a Canadian. And it's worse than that, because I suspect that the true picture is a lot more dismal than we know.
Yes.
Okay, so that's going to be dumped on you sometime in the next year. And so how are you going to deal with that? Like, how are you going to deal with the fact that the easiest thing to do for Canadians and for the remnants of the legacy media will be to wait until the Trudeau government collapses completely, dumps the economic mess on your shoulders, and then 2 months later proclaim that it's your fault.
Right.
Well, and it will be your responsibility at that point. And so, like...
they get the party, I get the hangover.
Oh, you definitely are going to get the hangover. There's no doubt about that. And that's a formidable set of problems. Now, as we've already pointed out, Canada has a tremendous number of natural and cultural advantages. But still, like, there's a lot of... Now, you have a Senate that's packed with Liberal progressives. Let's call them by their proper name. You have a Senate that's packed with progressives. You have a judiciary that's packed with progressives. You have municipalities all across the country that are progressive. Even once you win, there's going to be a lot of opposition to your movement forward, and you're going to inherit all these problems. So, like...
Are you trying to dissuade me from taking this
rough,
job,
man? And so, I mean, I want to know why you think you're ready. And it's been 2.5 years since we've had this conversation like this. Like, and what's your plan, and who are the people you have in positions to implement your plan, and why should Canadians have confidence in them?
So, my plan is pretty clear. We're going to cut bureaucracy, cut the consultants, cut foreign aid, cut back on corporate welfare to large corporations. We're going to use the savings to bring down the deficit and taxes and unleash the free enterprise system. We're going to repeal C-69, that's the anti-energy law, to cause a massive resource boom in our country and make it attractive for business to do the value-added work here in this country. So part of it's going to be growing out of this mess. You know, if you take the debt to GDP ratio, you have the denominator has to grow. And that's why we need a bigger, more powerful GDP that can fund our country and diminish the relative size of our debts. We're going to bring back a monetary discipline to bring down inflation, stop the money printing, and we're going to incentivize the municipalities to get building. But it's going to be a big fight with all of these things, because there are so many vested interests that will be trying to hold us back. So many small economic groups that have profited off the status quo. They will be fighting against me, and I'm going to have to put out a call to Canadians that they have to stay politically active. They can't assume that simply by changing, by voting in an election, that everything is going to, all the problems are going to reverse instantaneously. Like, I will need people to put pressure on the Senate to adopt my economic reforms. I will need people to put pressure on their mayors and local councillors to get out of the way and let us build homes. I will need businesses to actually do their part. I mean, our corporate Canada is so completely incompetent when it comes to politics. they're going to have to start to fight for the policies that are good for their workers more aggressively. And I've said that to them. They need to fire their incompetent lobbyists and actually go to the people and make the arguments for the reforms that I'm talking about. I want to get this done for the country, and I want to leave behind the opportunity for every other Canadian, the chance I had as a kid. And I know it's personal for me. I don't come from a privileged or wealthy background. I was adopted by school teachers, grew up in a normal suburban neighborhood. We didn't always have money, but I was able to get here.
Mm-hmm.
And my wife's the same story. She came here with nothing, and she's had a great life. Her family's had a great life. I love that about this country. And the idea that I could restore that as my life's work for other people, to me, that is exhilarating. That excites me. If that could be the only thing I do with my career, that would be an incredibly rewarding outcome.